Hello, everyone. This is Mel here, and I have a very prestigious guest here, Professor Peter von Sivers, who's agreed to do an interview with me. I met him a few weeks ago, back in May, at the Inara conference, and we had a lot of chats after the different talks, over a cup of coffee. Very interesting. But maybe for some of the audience, you're not familiar with Peter. So I'd like to just give a little introduction first before we start talking to you. You studied political science, history, and the culture of the Middle East, as well as philosophy at Ludwig Maximilian's Munich University and the School of Oriental and African Studies. You worked as a visiting assistant professor at Northwestern University and as associate professor at the University of Utah, which you are now an emeritus faculty member. You have published works on topics such as the political theory of Ibn Khaldun, medieval political thought and world history patterns, and your research focuses on Islamic origins and the debates of the 6th and 7th centuries. Would that be a fair summation?
That's a good short introduction. Yes, thank you.
I think probably the standout thing for me is the fact that you ground all your studies on the debates of the 6th and 7th century, which I don't see many others doing. And I think that's a great way into understanding what is happening with the Quran in particular, because a lot of people superimpose current ideas onto the 7th century, but we can go into that. I'd like to start with an observation that both you and the late Karl-Heinz Ohlig grew up in Oberlin, Germany. I'd like to ask you what memories stand out for you of Karl-Heinz as a friend and as a fellow researcher in the origins of Islam.
Well, I know him as a very generous, very mild, very open scholar. I don't remember him ever being angry or giving somebody short shrift. Yes, he could be a bit impatient if somebody was holding forth on something that he clearly disliked. But who are the scholars who are not a bit impatient? Anyway, I met him a few years before the first Inara conference to which I went. And I did so because I had learned about the Inara group and had taken up contact with them. We arranged then for a visit in Saarbrücken. And so it was at that, and he took me home then, actually, a very charming home on the other side of the Saar, a very skinny one dating to the 19th century or even earlier. So one had to climb very steep stairs up there. And so there we then continued. Earlier on, we met in a cafe with the larger group, also Gertrude Puin and a few others. So that was then the beginning, and then so altogether that is going back about 10 years or so. I have been in close contact, and initially Ohlig and now Kerr have been inviting me also to the conferences.
Yeah, you didn't know him growing up, did you, or was that just a coincidence?
No, we discovered, of course, during our first meeting that we had been from Koblenz. And chuckled a bit over the fact that he went to the gymnasium with old languages, and I went to the other one, the competition in Koblenz, with modern languages. And so he was about a year ahead or so in school of me. But of course, what connects us is that we both grew up in a city that was almost completely bombed to smithereens in World War II. And that is still very much with me, that memory of growing up in the ruins and playing and so on.
So I suppose just moving on from that, I've mentioned at the outset that, one of the things that you focus on a lot is looking at the debates that occurred in the 6th and 7th century. That is actually how I first heard of you. I remember seeing a lecture that you gave a number of years ago on the Gasnids and the Lakhmids, and I think that was a game changer for me because I understood that actually the real drama was happening up north and not down in the Hijaz, which essentially was in Arabia Deserta. But you've recently published a paper which is on the Arabian Heresy. And just kind of lead into that, the Chronicle of Sirt from the 9th to the 11th century mentions a synod of bishops in 570 to 590 that condemned a doctrine that has been called by Eusebius the Arabian Heresy. Can you tell us about that heresy and its history, please?
Yeah, it's an interesting heresy that pops up, or the mention of it pops up in sources, beginning actually with Origen, so one of the church fathers in the 200s, and then is being mentioned periodically in sources. There are about half a dozen or so, all the way up to the 700s. And that is very important because, of course, the origins of Islam fall into the early 600s. And the fact that we have these repeated mentions of the heresy, even though no further details, these are just brief mentions, means that the way I interpret this is that there were Christians in the area, let's call it the area South Jordan in the period it was called Palestina Tertia. So it corresponds to modern Jordan and Northwestern Arabia. So in that particular area, but also in the larger area all the way up to Mesopotamia. That was where this Arabian heresy was, but it's not really a heresy because the belief that they had as far as the resurrection was concerned was that upon death the soul and the body die, so everything disappears. But then in a new creation, the body and soul are being reconstituted, so to speak, by God in order for then the last judgment to take place, and the people are being sent then to paradise and hell. Now, I'm saying this is not really a heresy because there isn't any official doctrine in the churches as to the resurrection. We have, of course, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, where a discussion of resurrection takes place. That became more or less the official line in all churches. And the main point there of Paul is that resurrection is the soul, that if a person has died before the last day, the soul of that person goes either to Jesus or to God, stays with the two, and then therefore is alive, while the body is dead. But the body will be resurrected, of course, and then the two will be being put together. Yeah. This is called the pneumatic or pneumatic resurrection. In the sense that this is a reconfigured body that comes together with the soul, reconfigured because, of course, with the resurrection, this is no longer the old nature, so the sinful nature that is gone. And this raises, of course, the interesting question, if a non-sinful body is resurrected with the soul and then being sent to hell in the last judgment, how does that work logically? Well, not everything works logically as far as the resurrection is concerned, so let's keep that aside. But the important point here is the soul is alive, doesn't die. And that is a point that is vigorously denied and combated in the Quran. So we find dozens of verses where the warner, he's not called Muhammad in the early surahs of the Quran, the chapters, where the warner vilifies these people who believe in the death of the soul and the body, and then in a new creation are being recreated. What he advocates is the sleep of the soul. So I'm in this article that you have referenced, I'm saying that he apparently lived in Jordan or apparently in Jordan around the time when the Quran originated. And so one of the questions or assumptions is that the warner responsible for the revelations in the Quran encountered these alleged heretics there, condemning them. Now, the question was what happens to the soul after death, as I said, was never doctrinally decided in the church, although Paul was generally taken as being what the church says. But precisely because there was never any doctrine, as opposed for the Nicene Creed, for example, which is a doctrine that decrees the equality between God and Jesus as far as his divinity is concerned, and so on. So because there was no doctrine, therefore, in the church itself, there were also different opinions. Origen, for example, who also got angry at the people who believed in the death of the soul, much earlier, of course, 400 years earlier. He refuted them, and we have a text from him where that happens. Because there was no official doctrine, and this was more or less fluid, Origen then developed his own idea. He also spoke of a new body that God creates. That doesn't correspond exactly to Paul. Therefore, then, there was not a clear answer that the church gave. Now, the reason why in the 600s the warner of the Quran got so upset, I mean, this is a pious anger, really, that we find in the Quran. And I describe this as really the core. That was what the warner was so concerned about among the Christians of the region. The reason why this apparently became so dominant, while the heresy itself was more or less always sort of low level among Christians and never really caused much of concern. Why this suddenly became a concern was that in the mid-500s, the very well-known John Philoponus, theologian, but also much better known as the critic of Aristotle. He was actually one of the first who criticized Aristotle's physics and was thereby actually very important for the development of the modern science, I mean, up from Galileo onwards. Anyway, he was also a theologian, and it so happened that he was a Miaphysite theologian. The Miaphysites, also in the same region, were dominant. They were the Christian church, in contrast to the imperial church of Constantinople, the Chalcedonian. The Miaphysites came very close to divinizing Jesus. Jesus was crucified the cross as God, suffered as God, which is a remarkable conclusion, and then resurrected. The resurrection among Philoponus developed a doctrine according to which Trinity is actually a threesome of three persons, fully individualized. The hypothesis is a Greek term here for the individuality, meaning that he dissolved the Trinity and made three independent deities out of it. And he described that as as a numerical doctrine of 3 deities. At the same time, he also developed a doctrine parallel to the one of the Trinity, which one would have to call Tritheism. There were. Tritheism is the official name of it.
Yeah.
He also said that at the time of resurrection, the soul, which is alive, so he believed actually in the survival of the soul after death, will be united also with a numerically new soul. So, in short, Philoponus had a two-part doctrine: Tritheism, 3 independent deities, and resurrection with a numerically new body. Numerical meaning here that this has nothing to do with the old body, whether reconfigured as a pneumatic one or not, or whatever. Sorry to be a little detailed, but this is very important because, of course, that gets us then back to the heresy. Sorry, you want to ask that.
So just to make it clear for people, there is in the Arabian Heresy the idea of the complete obliteration of the soul, but there's also the concept that you mentioned of the sleeping of the soul. Could you tell us where that idea of the sleeping soul came from? Because I think that's important in terms of the contrast between the two.
Okay, yeah, I will be happy, but let me complete the thought that I had developed just a moment ago about Philoponus. Philoponus upset the entire region. So it was all the way up and down in Syria to Mesopotamia and so on. And 137 monasteries in Syria converted to this idea of Philoponus. So it was a really big deal in Miaphysite Christianity. But this is not what upset the warner in the Quran so much. Apparently, this Philoponian idea of Tritheism, of 3 deities, the dissolution of Trinity, reawakened, so to speak, these low-level Christians who had been living there all along and had been believing in probably 3 gods and or at least 1 god with associated figures, also deities, and then, of course, the death of the soul in the body. Okay, so that was then the combination of the two. Okay, so the Christian side, the dissolution of Trinity, and then the local low-level heresies, in quotation marks, side that somehow came together. And that was what the big scandal was in Syria at the beginning of the 600s. Okay, then back to the question that you just raised, which was?
So back to the question is, there's 2 concepts. You have the idea, which is the Arabian Heresy, of the dissolution or the obliteration of the soul.
Also the concept, sleep of the soul.
The sleep of the soul, Where did that come from?
Now that is yet another one. Okay, so we have now Paul and Philoponus, and then the Arabian Heresy. They all had different ideas about resurrection. Okay, now because the warner in the Quran was so vehemently opposed to the idea of the death of the soul, for which there's also a technical term, because he was so vehemently opposed, he offered, of course, then a solution for this conundrum, and that is the sleep of the soul. And that is, of course, the famous sleepers in the cave of Ephesus. The story of the sleepers is taken over in an abbreviated form in the Quran, where it forms the beginning of Surah 18. And so there we find these young folk who flee in Roman, this is much earlier, of course, this is legend, flee into this cave in order to escape Roman persecution as Christians at a time when Rome was not yet Christian. And then God made them fall asleep and reawakened them hundreds of years later. And that the fact in the warner's mind that that happened in the past, that God once resurrected a number of young men who had been asleep slash dead, I guess we would have to say, because that's the sleep of the soul. That was then the counteroffer. That was what then the Quranic believers should take away about the resurrection. There's an interesting verse also in the Quran where, which is very curious, where the warner actually says that at night, when a person falls asleep, God takes the soul to himself and returns it in the morning to the sleeper when he wakes up. So that's also an idea here. One is quasi-dead at night. Not very far from what we know today about consciousness and how consciousness works. So that would be then the solution that the Quran offers. Now, back to why this is so important for understanding Islam. It shows that in its origins, the warner, so I avoid calling him Muhammad because he calls himself that only in the later verses of the Quran, which one can date to about 650 or 670. That's the time when the Quran was redacted. So he is merely the warner, and he preaches now this new message of the omnipotent single God who doesn't have is opposed to Tritheism, and this is very important also in the Quran. The Quran does not mention Trinity at all. The word doesn't appear there. It merely says, do not say three. And it is for that reason that I'm saying that it is Tritheism that is being combated in the Quran. Now, all of this is extremely important because it demonstrates that the Quran originated in a, let me be very general, very unprejudicious, so to speak, in an area to the north of the Hijaz. So when we are talking about the northwest of Arabia, the area that I previously described as Jordan or southeastern Byzantine Empire, adjacent to it is the province of Madian. This is biblical Midian. And Madian stretches way into Hejaz, just a few hundred miles north of Medina. So the only conclusion that I can draw from this is that the Quran originated in them through the warner who preached it in this northwest area, and it was in this area that the warner and his followers presumably preached all the way down, potentially to Medina. There is an additional point which I discovered actually accidentally, only after coming back from the conference in Trier. And that is, the Quran also has a verse, a very curious verse, that is 42, 6 to 7, which speaks of the mother of all cities, al-Qura. For any traditional scholar dealing with Islam, so here I'm talking about the established Orientalist field, it's very clear that is a reference to Mecca, the mother of cities. Well, no, the mother of cities is Jerusalem. And the verse reads that God sent down the revelation, presumably the revelation about the soul and resurrection and God the omnipotent. He sent that down to warn the people of these violence. Now, mother of cities, metropolis, was a very common expression for Jerusalem. All the way down, I found references into the 6th century Cyril of Scythopolis, sorry, still mentioned the mother of us all, Mother Zion, mother of the churches. This was a very common expression. So we have here, in my opinion, unrefutable proof that when the Warner received its revelations, these revelations were destined to the people of Jerusalem to be warned of the impending
Wow.
last day, the
Can,
end of the world. So that is why it is so important to be relatively flexible about the area where these
yeah.
origins could have been, because there are also toponyms for Madian that are mentioned in the Quran. So in my opinion, this is all very clear. Unfortunately, of
Yeah.
course, the Orientalist establishment writes about the Quran, Muhammad, the origins of Islam, from the perspective of the Abbasid caliphs who came to power in 750, but the scholarship developed only from about 900 onwards.
Yeah.
The official, and then of course all classical Islamic scholarship, which Orientalists follow, which was then written after the 900s, that scholarship assumes that the origin was in Mecca, that the Quran was revealed there, that whatever incidental points that the Quran contains about Christianity and Judaism were conveyed to Muhammad either through merchants who traveled through Medina or through Mecca. And that's the vision or perspective that Orientalism takes. But this can't be true. I mean, we have so many references in the Quran that point to the Northwest that we cannot talk otherwise about it.
Can I just circle you back a little bit to
Yes.
that question of the Quran is not anti-Trinitarian, but is actually attacking Tritheism. Can you talk a little
That's
bit
right.
about the Arabic in terms of the word three there and how it's different from the word for Trinity? And maybe can you bring in your discussion on the Associators? Who are the Associators? Are they Christians
Yeah.
or are they another group?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So the conclusion would be that those who are forbidden to say three are Christians who happen to be Tritheists. In other words, they believe in God, and then another God, Jesus, and then we don't talk much about the Spirit, but that would be, of course, another one. We know, of course, that John identifies the Spirit with the Paraclete, so the Spirit is being personified after all. So whether it's two or three doesn't matter here. But the important point here is three independent deities. And that, of course, is what the Quran also condemns, the three, because God, the omnipotent, doesn't have any gods with him associated or not.
Yeah.
Tradition, again, the Orientalism to which the majority of scholars teaching today at universities adhere, they say that the Quran condemns a Trinity um, um, because of the assertion repeated many times in the Quran that God is independent, that God is omnipotent. And this uh, omnipotence, then with the condemnation of any associators, that modern or contemporary Orientalists, but all the Islamic scholarship since 900 asserts this, that was pagan. So
Yeah.
in other words, there was paganism in Arabia that Muhammad reformed by receiving the revelation of the Quran in Mecca. And from then on, the Meccans, Medinans combated the paganism of Arabia. And the paganism, of course, is that there is a god who is the highest one, but he is associating himself with other gods. And when one has misfortunes in one's life, one prays to these other gods in order to have then intercessors with the omnipotent God in order then to get either the sins forbidden or one's disease healed or whatever else one is praying for. So this is the contrast. The official religion, as it is being taught now also in the schools in Europe to little Muslim children, is that the Quran or Islam is the religion that with which the pagans of Arabia were brought into the mainstream of monotheism.
Yeah. Now, you say in the your paper that rather than the impression that it's arguing that Christians are believers in three gods, the Quran asserts that Christianity is monotheistic. I think you referred to surahs 262 and 569. So this is a very different take on it. So what you're saying is that the debate from John Philoponus about the nature of God, that what his ideas that were taken up by the monks is what the Quran is attacking, not the Trinity.
Yeah. So there is this verse which you mentioned, where actually the Quran says the Christians are monotheists, and they therefore have a book, a revelation, and so therefore they are not our opponents.
Yeah.
This notion that they are clearly monotheists, which is by the way confirmed and also by an Eastern Christian who debated a Muslim emir later, 200 years later.
Was that Bishop Elias?
Yes,
of Sivers.
Exactly.
Yeah,
that's it. Yeah. So that's very clear, and therefore then again it is the Islamic tradition. Okay, so traditional Oriental scholarship that follows the Islamic tradition that says that Islam is opposed to Trinity, which it was. It was opposed to the specific form of Philoponus, this Tritheism. By the way, Philoponus was actually very prophetic when he pronounced this doctrine of Tritheism. He said, now that I have said that, essentially, there's this, I'm paraphrasing the quote, now I have said this, there are only the only choices then that exist for Christians, so he's speaking, of course, to his Miaphysite friends, that Christianity returns to Judaism, embraces atheism, or hedonism. The Epicureans were, of course, not players at all in Arabia. So from where he got that, I don't know. But the interesting thing is the only choice that is now possible after Tritheism, that with which I have demolished Trinity, that will be a return to the single God. For him, that was, of course, Judaism, but of course, it was Islam that returned to the single God. So we have here a person responding to Philoponus by receiving the revelation of the one God. Excellent.
Just one other little question is the term Ala Raf, which is the heights. The idea that when the person is brought, as it were, to the pearly gates, they wait there to receive their resurrected body. This is an idea that is found in the Quran, and the question is, where did that come from? And any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, that has predecessors in Eastern Christianity, where there's a similar idea of mansions on the heights, so on the rim of the world, where there is a waiting period for the reunification before God then in the last judgment sends the people left or right, let's say, put it this way. This notion of a short period apparently is considered to be necessary theologically or scripturally, I guess, because of course the act of putting soul and body together, precisely because it was so controversial many times in Christianity, needs to be completed before a judgment, the last judgment, can occur. So we are talking about the three steps of resurrection, judgment, and the hell or paradise thereafter. Let me mention one point also that still relates to Christianity being considered in the Quran as a monotheism and not being
polytheistic or something.
pulled apart as through Trinity. Yeah, that is, there is also in the Quran a discussion of the pilgrimage at Mount Arafat. That's of course the big pilgrimage as compared to the small one around the Kaaba. This big pilgrimage was apparently a place where Christians went, maybe merchants, we don't know. It's Arafat, this hill or a small mountain, is in the vicinity of Mecca today, and was near market cities of Yemen, where possibly the Christian merchants went. That there were Christians is documented in the Quran through a small piece in a verse, which forbids, that's the warner in the Quran, forbids Muslims to utter the call to prayer on Mount Arafat, with which the pilgrimage begins, to utter, here we stand. And this is the Labaika, as it is called in Arabic. And this is obscured in the Quran as a formula that should not be used. The Quran replaces it with the proper Quranic formula. Now, Raymond Kurbert, an Orientalist who lived in Rome and was associated with the Roman Curia, he wrote a series of articles. Nobody cites them anymore, and I use them in the manuscript, where he demonstrates that this particular phrase that is found in the Quran is actually an obscure reference to the Christian formula to the beginning of the pilgrimage. And what is this Christian formula? A citation of a verse from 1 Corinthians, where Paul speaks about the resurrection.
Wow.
So there we have a reference in the Quran to Christianity having been associated once with a pilgrimage. Unfortunately, this has completely disappeared. Nobody cites Kurbert anymore. The whole discussion here of this, of what this call to prayer was, which was very important in medieval and then also modern Orientalist scholarship, that was never discussed. That has a Christian connection. So there we have again one more Christian connection in the Quran, which just overflows with these connections, and it's very difficult to agree with Orientalists who say, "Oh no, it all started in Mecca and was against pagan Arabs."
Yeah, I suppose the big debate is Islam the result of Christianity or some form of Christianity or Judaism? One of the things you say in the paper is that the Jews had a morning prayer which referred to the idea of the sleep of the soul, which might indicate there's actually a mixture of Christian and Jewish influences. Do you want to say something on that, if it's not circling you back too much?
Yeah, no, there are of course also Jewish influences, but they are Talmud particularly. The Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, appears, of course, many times in the Quran, but is cited probably via what the Christians received, because for the Christians, of course, the Hebrew Bible was the preparation for the New Testament. There's a very recent article just published in April, which I found after 2 years. I'm continuing to on these topics. The article by a scholar, Australian scholar by the name of Samuel Zimmer, Zimmer. He seeks to demonstrate with the article that the references in the Quran to Christianity are all very precise. They are not necessarily to specific to single verses. They are often to groups of verses or make paraphrases and so on. And Zimmer wrote this article against all those Orientalist scholars who say that Muhammad had a very superficial, indirect knowledge of Christianity that he received somehow in Medina, or there is always this assumption of Muhammad having undertaken commercial trips from Mecca or Medina to Jerusalem or to Syria.
Picked it up on the grapevine, as it were.
Yeah, because Mecca was the great merchant city, which of course it wasn't. Yeah. There were, of course, journeys all the time. I mentioned the Christians who went to Mount Arafat. Merchants in that area traveled. And actually, we should be very precise here also as far as the trade is concerned. The Byzantines had a considerable trade with India and China for silk and cottons. Cottons were very popular in Rome. And this is also important. The trade route, insofar as the Red Sea is concerned, there was, of course, another trade route through the Arabian Gulf. That trade route went as far about as half of the Red Sea. And the reason for this is one cannot sail further north because the winds are irregular throughout most of the time. So one has to be very lucky if one wants to sail all the way up to Aqaba and Petra and trade from there to Petra for the goods one is trading. Now, if one sails only up halfway, then one lands in Loikik-Pome, as it was called. Unfortunately, archaeology has not yet been able to determine whether this is indeed the place. So this is still awaiting archaeological research. But the interesting thing here is, if one say it's up halfway, the Red Sea, and then goes via the land route with camel caravans, one would have to go from Medina to Petra.
Okay.
Mecca was not on the trade route. So we know nothing about Mecca. The first documented evidence for it dates to the year 692. So the very end, actually, of the conquest of the Muslim Arabs. And there's not a word about Mecca. There's only the valley of Mecca that the Quran mentions.
So just check if I understand you. What you're saying is a little bit different from Patricia Crona's take on the Arabian trade, because she would say there was no trade by land, but you're saying there had to be because of the northerly winds would have made sailing up along the last part a difficulty.
That's right. Yeah. This is new research which modifies Crona's research. Krona, by the way, also said the Quran must have originated somewhere in the Northwest, but there she stayed. She was never any more committal to any more precise definition of where it was in the Northwest. So the idea of the Quran originating in the Northwest has been around since 1978, and that's why there is this tension between Orientalists on one hand and scholars like the people involved with Inara, who say no, it must be in a place other than Mecca. And so this is important, but I don't know where really the debate stands. There is a very recent article again by Nikolai Zinai, who is now is originally from Germany, but he's a professor in Oxford at one of the colleges there. He just published an article with a somewhat, shall we say, awkward title, "The Elephant in the Meccan Room."
Oh, really?
This,
I just recently published a video with almost the same title by accident, "The Elephant in the Room," but anyway.
Yeah, so and the elephants are apparently the three scholars who are critical of the Orientalist assumption of Mecca against paganism, etc. He has a debate with the critical scholars, Shoemaker, Guillaume D at the University of Brussels, and the third one, Tommaso Tesi, who is originally from Italy but teaches now at the Chinese university. And by the way, I mean, teaching at a Chinese university, he should be teaching at Oxford because of his scholarship. But sorry, there's a slightly polemical aside that I permitted myself. Anyway, Zinai argued in this article that these polemical attacks by Orientalists against the deviance of Inara, etc., that should calm down and one should discuss all of this seriously, because the three scholars who are the elephants in the room are serious scholars who can be discussed concerning their critical attitude towards Orientalism and towards the origin of the Quran in Mecca and Medina. And that's, of course, exactly the same that I'm also saying.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned at the beginning of this article that you have, I finished a book manuscript. I'm now in the middle of negotiations. So I'm hoping that this book will appear in about a year or a year and a half.
Oh, brilliant.
And will add to the idea of, well, maybe somewhere in the Northwest.
Yeah. Well, that's brilliant, because I think the very first correspondence I had with you, I was asking about that very manuscript that you're finally there, or almost within a whisker. Yeah, so it'll be interesting.
Exactly.
So it'll be interesting to see your overall picture on things. Professor Peter, this has been an amazing chance to explore your paper. I have to say, and it's not flattery, I think it's one of the best papers of this year, if not the last few years, because it has such strong explanatory power to explain what's really going on. I think it will help an awful lot of people get rid of wrong ideas, because I think if people don't know who the Associators are, I think they're missing an awful lot. I think if people confuse the Quran's polemic against the Tritheists as being about the Trinitarians, then they've fundamentally misunderstood the Quran, and then what hope have you in understanding the rest of it? So I think it's a massive contribution. And I'm going to share a link to your paper so that people can have a look at it afterwards.
Oh, yeah, the English version, which is on Academia.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you are very kind with your remarks about my paper, and I certainly appreciate it with much gratitude.
So on that, thank you so much for being willing to come and do this interview. Just to explain to the audience, we did do an interview at Inara, and unfortunately my luggage got robbed by someone at the airport, and had a lovely little interview with you, unfortunately, but at least we got a chance to redo it, and probably at a much greater depth the second time round than the first time. So I think that's probably a blessing there.
Yeah, so the second time around, the second version, I think, went into greater depth than before. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much. Your remarks were very kind about this paper.
Thank you very much.